In our world, justice is a construct of human reason. It is a vast, intricate, and often frustrating machine, built from the cold steel of evidence, the polished wood of precedent, the tangled wires of testimony, and the flickering light of logic. We have forensic science, a meticulous discipline that teaches us to read the silent, invisible stories told by stray hairs, drops of blood, and the unique whorls and ridges of a fingerprint. We have surveillance cameras that act as impartial, unblinking witnesses, their digital memories immune to the frailties of human recollection. We have armies of lawyers, skilled artisans of rhetoric who build towering, complex arguments of fact and law. And ultimately, we have juries of our peers, 12 ordinary men and women tasked with the immense, almost sacred responsibility of sifting through this mountain of information to determine, beyond a reasonable doubt, the guilt or innocence of an individual. The entire system, for all its manifest flaws and imperfections, is predicated on one fundamental guiding idea: that truth is something that can be discovered by human beings through careful, methodical, rational investigation. Now, I want you to take that idea, that entire framework of modern jurisprudence, and set it aside. I want you to mentally dismantle that intricate machine, piece by piece. Forget the evidence locker. Forget the cross-examination. Forget DNA analysis. Forget the very concept of reasonable doubt. I want you to imagine a world where a heinous crime has been committed, a theft in the dead of night, a murder in a dark, muddy alley, a whispered accusation of adultery that threatens to tear a family and a community apart. And in this world, there are no witnesses. There is no confession. There is no physical evidence to analyze. There is only one person's word, one family's honor, pitted against another's. What do you do? Where do you turn? In a world steeped in a faith that was as real and as tangible as the stone of a church wall, in a world where the hand of God was not an abstract theological concept but a potent, active force in the daily lives of men and women, you did not turn to human reason. Human reason was fallible, corruptible, and weak. You turned to God. You did not seek to discover the truth through your own flawed faculties. You sought to have it revealed to you from on high. You would create a moment of sacred theater, a legal ritual designed to invite, or rather, to compel God to intervene directly in the affairs of men, to perform a small, localized, legally binding miracle that would point the finger at the guilty and vindicate the innocent. This process, this formal, terrifying, and profoundly sacred appeal to a divine arbiter, was known across Europe as the trial by ordeal. In the formal language of the law and the church, it was the judicium Dei, the judgment of God. And for hundreds of years, it was not some bizarre backwater folk custom. It was the ultimate, final, and most feared form of justice in the Western world. This is the story of how entire societies, faced with the frustrating limits of human knowledge, chose to outsource their legal system to the Almighty, using boiling water, red-hot iron, and the chilling, silent depths of a cold river as their instruments of divine inquiry. To truly understand the logic, and to the medieval mind, there was a logic off the trial by ordeal, we must first step back and paint a picture of the world that created it. We must understand the legal and psychological vacuum that it was designed to fill. The early medieval period, the era that followed the slow, painful collapse of the Western Roman Empire, was not a world of centralized states, professional police forces, or a unified legal code. The monolithic structure of Roman law and administration had crumbled, leaving behind a fragmented landscape of small, competing Germanic kingdoms, the lands of the Franks, the Goths, the Lombards, the Anglo-Saxons. Law in this barbarian successor world was local, personal, and deeply rooted in Germanic custom. It was not primarily concerned with abstract concepts like justice for the state. It was concerned with keeping the peace. Its primary function was to manage and resolve the blood feuds that were the default response to injury and death. If a man from your family was killed by a man from another family, the ancient, honorable response was revenge. Your family was obligated to kill a member of the offending family, which in turn obligated them to seek revenge on you, and so on in a devastating, society-destroying cycle of violence. The earliest forms of Germanic law were designed to interrupt this cycle. They did this by establishing a system of compensation, a detailed tariff for every conceivable injury. The most famous of these is the Wehrgild, or man price. Every person in society, from the king down to the lowliest peasant, had a specific monetary value assigned to them. If you killed a person, their family was entitled to demand their Wehrgild from your family. Paying for a broken arm was cheaper than paying for a lost eye. Killing a freeman was cheaper than killing a nobleman. This system, while it seems crude to us, was a brilliant piece of social engineering. It replaced blood with money, vengeance with negotiation, and provided a path to peace. But this system had an obvious weak point. It only worked if everyone agreed on who had committed the crime in the first place. What if you were accused of a crime, and therefore liable for a fine or a Wehrgild, but you insisted you were innocent? This is where the first layer of preordeal justice came into play: the oath. The oath in the early medieval world was not the casual, almost meaningless act it can be today. It was a conditional self-curse. An accused person could attempt to clear their name by swearing a solemn oath of innocence, typically upon a holy relic, a fragment of a saint's bone, a piece of the true cross, a revered gospel book. By doing so, you were effectively saying, "May my immortal soul be damned to hell for all eternity if what I am saying is not the truth." In an age of universal and profound Christian faith, this was the highest possible stake. To swear a false oath, to perjure oneself on a sacred object, was to knowingly choose eternal damnation. It was a terrifying prospect, and you rarely swore this oath alone. For the oath to be legally valid, you had to produce a number of oath helpers, or in Latin, compurgators. These were respected members of the community, your kinsmen, your neighbors, who would come to court and swear alongside you. They were not swearing that they knew for a fact that you were innocent. They were not eyewitnesses. They were swearing that they believed your oath was a clean and unperjured one. Essentially, they were character witnesses, staking their own souls on their belief in your integrity. The number of oath helpers required varied depending on the severity of the crime and your social status. Clearing yourself of a charge of minor theft might require only a handful of helpers. Clearing yourself of a murder charge might require a dozen or more, including men of high rank. This system of compurgation was a powerful tool of social control. Your ability to find enough oath helpers depended entirely on your reputation within the community. If you were an honorable, trustworthy person, your neighbors would be willing to support you. If you were a known liar, a troublemaker, a person of ill repute, you would find no one willing to risk their immortal soul for you. The system reinforced the need for a good reputation and conformity to communal norms. For many minor disputes, a successful oath was enough to settle the matter. The accuser was honor-bound to accept it, and peace was restored. But what happened when this human mechanism of justice failed? What happened when the crime was too serious, like murder or treason, where the king or lord refused to allow a simple oath? What if the accused was a person of very low standing, a slave or a serf, whose oath was considered worthless in the eyes of the law? What if they were a stranger to the community, with no kinsmen or neighbors to serve as oath helpers? What if the evidence, circumstantial as it might be, was so strong against them that no one believed their oath? In these critical cases, when the system of human testimony and reputation broke down, the law needed a final, unimpeachable arbiter. It needed a higher court of appeal. This is the moment that the legal system escalated. It moved from a judgment of men to the judicium Dei. It moved to the ordeal. The adoption of the ordeal was facilitated by the process of Christianization itself. As Germanic kings and peoples converted to Christianity, they did not simply abandon their old ways. Instead, a process of syncretism occurred. Old pagan customs were absorbed and repurposed within a new Christian framework. The Church, in its effort to convert and control these warrior societies, wisely co-opted many of their traditions. The ordeal, which likely had pre-Christian, pagan roots as a form of divination, was sanctified. It was transformed from a consultation with pagan gods or nature spirits into a direct appeal to the one, true Christian God. God would now be the ultimate judge, the divine king presiding over the ultimate trial. The ordeal, therefore, was not a spontaneous act of mob violence or a rustic superstition. It was a deeply serious and highly ritualized legal and religious ceremony, meticulously planned and executed. It was almost always presided over by a priest, the official representative of the divine on earth. It often took place within the most sacred space in the community, the church itself, or on consecrated ground just outside its doors. The procedures were laid down in the official law codes of kings and in the liturgical books of the church. The accused was not simply grabbed and subjected to a test. There was a formal, multi-day preparation designed to purify the body and soul, and to focus the mind on the terrifying gravity of the moment. Typically, the accused would be required to fast for 3 days prior to the ordeal, consuming only bread, water, salt, and herbs. They were to abstain from sexual relations and all worldly pleasures. They were required to attend daily mass, make offerings, and spend their time in constant, fervent prayer. This was a period of intense spiritual purification. The idea was to make the accused a clean vessel, worthy of receiving God's direct judgment. It was also, undoubtedly, a period of immense and calculated psychological pressure. Imagine yourself in this position. For 3 days you are isolated, hungry, and terrified. Your entire world has narrowed to this single, impending event. Your every waking moment is spent in a church, surrounded by images of saints and martyrs. The air thick with the smell of incense and beeswax. Your ears filled with the solemn chants of the liturgy. You are constantly reminded of the power of God, the pains of hell, and the absolute necessity of truth. It is not difficult to imagine that many guilty parties, facing the terrifying prospect of a direct, physical encounter with divine power, would choose to confess during this preparatory period. A confession, even if it led to punishment, was preferable to the sin of blasphemously challenging God to a test. This psychological coercion was a feature, not a bug, of the system. It was designed to produce confessions before the ordeal ever needed to happen. When the day of the ordeal finally arrived, the ceremony would reach its dramatic climax. A special mass would be held, the Mass of the Ordeal. The entire community would be present, packed into the church, watching in hushed silence. For them, this was not a piece of legal theater. It was a moment of profound religious significance, a tear in the veil between the earthly and the divine. They were about to witness God's justice made manifest. The priest, in his full and most solemn vestments, would formally consecrate the instruments of the ordeal, the water in the cauldron, the iron bar in the fire, formally inviting God to inhabit these physical elements and use them to reveal the hidden truth. He would then turn to the accused and deliver a powerful adjuration, a formal charge that was both a prayer and a terrifying warning. The language of these liturgies, which survive in manuscripts, is chilling in its intensity. Let us listen, in translation, to a fragment of one such adjuration from an Old English text, to get a sense of the atmosphere. I charge you, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and by your Christianity, and by the right hand which you hold. If you are guilty of this crime, either by deed or by counsel, if you have acted with the devil in you, or have consented to his acts, that you do not presume to approach the communion or undergo this ordeal unless you first confess your guilt. But if you are innocent of the charge, in thought and in deed, I pray that Almighty God, who is a just judge, who freed Susanna from false accusation, who saved Daniel from the lion's den, will deign to free you and declare you innocent. After this final, terrifying warning, the time had come. The accused would step forward to face their judgment. Now, let us examine the ordeals themselves, the different doors through which God's judgment was invited to enter the world. While there were many local variations, the most common can be grouped into a few major categories. Let us begin with the most dramatic, the ordeal of fire. The most widespread form of this was the ordeal of hot iron, or judicium feri candentis. A piece of iron, usually a bar or sometimes a plowshare, of a legally prescribed weight, typically 1 pound for a simple ordeal, 3 pounds for a triple ordeal for more serious crimes, would be placed in a roaring fire during the Mass. It would be heated until it glowed a terrifying red hot. After the final prayers and consecrations, the accused, standing before the altar, would have to pick up this piece of incandescent iron. They then had to carry it a set distance, usually 9 feet, marked out on the church floor. After they dropped the iron, their burned hand would be immediately wrapped in a cloth bandage, which was then bound with cord and sealed with the priest's own wax seal to prevent any tampering. And here we come to a crucial and often profoundly misunderstood part of the process. The judgment did not happen at the moment of contact. No one, not even the most fervent believer, expected a truly innocent person to handle red-hot iron without being burned. That would be a miracle of the highest order, reserved for saints. The true Judicium Dei was revealed not in the burning, but in the healing. The accused would be sent away for 3 days. 3 agonizing days of prayer and waiting, the fate of their life and soul wrapped up in a sealed bandage. On the 3rd day, they would return to the priest and the community. In a moment of high drama, the seal would be broken, and the bandages would be slowly, carefully unwound. The priest, the official arbiter, would then inspect the wound. If the hand was healing cleanly, if the burn was free from what they would call corruption festering, pus, a putrid smell, the person was declared innocent. God had intervened, performing a miracle of healing to show his favor and vindicate the innocent. But if the wound was infected, suppurating, and foul, the person was declared guilty. God had withheld his divine grace, allowing the inner corruption of the soul to be made manifest in the physical corruption of the flesh. A similar and equally terrifying logic applied to the ordeal of hot water, the judicium aquae ferventis. A large cauldron of water would be brought to a fierce, churning boil over a fire inside or just outside the church. A stone or sometimes a ring would be thrown into the boiling water. The accused would have to plunge their bare arm into the cauldron, sometimes up to the wrist for a simple ordeal, up to the elbow for a triple ordeal, and retrieve the object. As with the iron, the scalded arm was then immediately bandaged and sealed by the priest. And as before, the divine verdict was delivered 3 days later, based on the state of the wound's healing. Imagine the sheer psychological and physical torment of this process. The 3 days of fasting and sleepless fear, the solemnity of the Mass, the weight of the entire community's gaze upon you, the terrifying sight of the glowing iron or the roiling cauldron, the searing, undeniable, excruciating pain of the act itself, and then the agonizing 3-day wait, your entire future dependent on how your own body chose to react to a grievous injury in a world with no concept of antibiotics, sterilization, or modern hygiene. In such conditions, some degree of infection was a near certainty. A verdict of innocent, a wound found to be clean and healing after 3 days, would have been, in a very real and practical sense, a miracle. It's not hard to see why they believed God's hand was at work. But what if you were a powerful nobleman, a proud knight who could not be expected to submit to such a humbling commoner's ordeal, one that left a permanent, disfiguring scar. For the upper echelons of this warrior society, there was often a different path, one more suited to their martial ethos, though one no less reliant on the judicium Dei, the trial by combat. This was, in essence, a duel, but a duel elevated to the level of a formal legal proceeding, the iudicium per duellum. The accuser and the accused, or in many cases, hired champions fighting on their behalf, would meet on a designated field of combat. The proceedings were surrounded with immense ritual. Both combatants would swear solemn oaths on holy relics, calling on God to strike them down if their cause was unjust. They would attend Mass, and their weapons would be blessed by a priest. Then, under the watchful eyes of the court and the community, they would fight, often to the death, or until one combatant yielded and cried craven. The belief was simple and direct. God, the Lord of hosts, would not allow a righteous man to be defeated by a liar or a villain. He would grant strength, skill, and fortune to the arm of the innocent and would cause the guilty to fall. The victor of the combat was not just the better fighter. He was the one whom God had judged to be in the right. The loser, if he survived, was not only defeated but also declared legally guilty and would often be summarily executed, or, in the case of a champion, disgraced. This form of ordeal, with its inherent drama and martial glamour, would prove to be the most resilient. It would outlive the others by centuries, slowly transforming from a formal legal process into the aristocratic and illegal duel of honor. Now we come to perhaps the most famous, most culturally persistent, and certainly the most widely misinterpreted of all the ordeals, the ordeal of cold water. The Latin name for it was the aquae frigidi examen, the examination by cold water. This is the ordeal that popular culture, through plays like Arthur Miller's The Crucible and countless films, has forever linked with the later witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. But its original form and purpose in early medieval law were quite different, and its logic is profoundly and fascinatingly counterintuitive to the modern mind. In the medieval ordeal of cold water, the accused was first bound, typically with their right thumb tied to their left big toe and their left thumb tied to their right big toe. This created a helpless, trussed position that minimized their ability to struggle or swim. They would then be tied to a rope and lowered into a body of whatever river, a lake, or a specially constructed pool near the church that had been solemnly blessed and consecrated by the priest. During the consecration, the priest would deliver a powerful prayer, charging the water, in the name of God, not to receive the body of a guilty and perjured person. And here is the crucial twist that modern interpretations so often get wrong. If the accused sank into the water, they were declared innocent. If they floated, they were declared guilty. Let that sink in for a moment. Sinking was good. Floating was bad. To our modern scientific minds, which understand the principles of buoyancy, body density, and the air trapped in lungs and clothing, this seems utterly insane, a cruel and arbitrary game of chance. But to the medieval mind, the logic was perfectly clear and deeply theological. Water, especially after it had been blessed by a priest and charged with God's power, was considered an element of absolute purity. It was the water of baptism, the very substance that washed away original sin. The belief was that this pure, holy water would symbolically and literally reject a body that was corrupted by the sin of a grievous crime and a false oath. The guilty person, filled with the lightness of their sin and deceit, polluted by the devil, would be repelled by the pure element and would float shamefully on the surface. The innocent person, being pure in their oath and their soul, would be accepted, embraced by the pure water, and would sink into its depths. Of course, the accused who sank and was thereby proven innocent was not left to drown. That would defeat the entire purpose of the trial. The rope tied around them was there for a reason. They were meant to be pulled back out of the water, gasping, shivering, and half-drowned, but gloriously vindicated by God. The ordeal was a test, not an execution. The execution, for those unfortunate enough to float and be found guilty, would come later, usually by hanging. This clear distinction is vital to understanding the historical reality. The later swimming of witches, which took place hundreds of years after the formal age of ordeals had passed, was a brutal and debased folk perversion of this tradition. It was often a form of mob justice, not a formal legal proceeding presided over by a priest. And it frequently operated on the opposite cynical, no-win logic. If you floated, you were a witch and were executed, and if you sank, you were innocent but were left to drown anyway. The original ordeal of cold water was a structured, if terrifying, legal test with a clear, established path to proving one's innocence. There were other, less common and less physically brutal ordeals as well, which reveal even more about the social psychology of the age. One of the most fascinating was the ordeal of the morsel, or in Old English, the corsand, which literally means cursed bread. This ordeal was typically reserved for clergy accused of a crime, as it was considered unseemly for a man of God to shed blood or be subjected to the same tests as a common layman. A piece of bread, usually barley bread or sometimes cheese, would be consecrated during the Mass. A prayer would be said over it, asking God that if the accused was guilty, the bread should stick in their throat and cause them to choke or be unable to swallow. The accused would then have to step before the altar and eat the consecrated morsel. If they swallowed it without difficulty, they were innocent. If they choked, gagged, sputtered, or were physically unable to swallow it, they were declared guilty. While framed as a divine judgment, this functions as a remarkably effective primitive lie detector test. We know today that intense psychological stress, fear, and the consciousness of one's own guilt can trigger the body's fight or flight response, which includes the mouth going dry and the throat constricting. Trying to swallow a piece of dry barley bread under such conditions would be genuinely difficult for a guilty person. We even have a famous, if likely legendary, story about this from 11th century Anglo-Saxon England. The powerful Earl Godwin of Wessex, accused of being complicit in the murder of the king's brother, supposedly attempted to prove his innocence at a royal banquet. He took a piece of bread and declared, "May this morsel be my last if I am guilty in thought or in deed." According to the legend, he put the bread in his mouth, immediately choked, and fell down dead. His guilt proven in the most dramatic and final fashion imaginable. Another ordeal, used particularly in the Carolingian Empire, was the ordeal of the cross, Judicium Crucis. The accuser and the accused would stand before a cross in the church, with their arms outstretched in the form of a cross themselves. They would have to hold this physically demanding position for the duration of a long Mass. The first person to lower their arms out of exhaustion was declared the loser, and therefore guilty. Here, God's judgment was revealed through physical endurance, a test of will and faith as much as strength. So, for several hundred years, this was the legal reality of Western Europe. The trial by ordeal was not an anomaly. It was a fundamental, integrated part of the justice system. It was codified in the great law codes of kings like Charlemagne in the Frankish Empire and King Athelstan in England. It was sanctioned, administered, and legitimized by the full authority of the Christian Church. It was a perfectly logical, if terrifying, system for a society that believed in an all-powerful, ever-present, and consistently interventionist God. But then it stopped. Not overnight, but with what is, in historical terms, astonishing speed. This entire system of divine justice, which had dominated European legal thought for half a millennium, crumbled and all but disappeared from official practice. Why? What happened to make an entire continent abandon a practice so deeply embedded in its culture, its laws, and its faith? The story of its decline is as fascinating as the story of its rise. The downfall of the ordeal was not caused by a single event, but by a powerful and converging combination of growing skepticism, a renewed interest in a different and more ancient form of law, and a profound, revolutionary theological shift within the Church itself. First, there was simple, practical skepticism. Even in an age of profound faith, people were not fools. They could see that the ordeals were not always infallible and could be subject to human manipulation. A wealthy accused might bribe a priest to heat the iron just a little less, or to pull it from the fire a moment too soon. It was whispered that certain salves and preparations could be applied to the hand beforehand to protect it, or afterwards to promote unnaturally fast healing. In the ordeal of cold water, a clever executioner could use the rope to subtly pull a person up or push them down, predetermining the outcome based on who had paid him more. Stories and suspicions of such manipulations, whether true or not, began to circulate, slowly eroding public confidence in the ordeal as an incorruptible judgment of God. But the most powerful challenge came not from the village green, but from the lecture hall. The 12th century saw a great intellectual awakening in Europe, a period so dynamic it is often called the 12th century Renaissance. It was the age of the foundation of the first great universities, in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, and one of the most exciting and prestigious subjects being studied in these new, vibrant centers of learning was law. Specifically, scholars rediscovered and began to systematically study a vast and incredibly sophisticated body of legal thought that had been largely lost to Western Europe for centuries. Roman law. The great compilation of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis of the 6th century Emperor Justinian, was a revelation to 12th century minds. Here was a complete legal system, covering everything from contracts and property to criminal procedure, built not on divine appeals and supernatural tests, but on evidence, rational argument, testimony, and logical procedure. It offered a completely different, and to many a far more compelling way of thinking about how to achieve justice. As this new generation of university-trained lawyers and clerks began to fill the administrations of kings and nobles, they brought with them a profound preference for probatorational proof over the ordeal. They began to build a world where justice was the business of educated men, not a matter for God's direct intervention. However, the final, decisive, killing blow against the trial by ordeal came not from a king's court or a lawyer's brief, but from the highest authority in the Christian world, the papacy. In the year 1215, one of the most powerful, intelligent, and influential popes of the Middle Ages, Pope Innocent III, convened a great church council in the Lateran Palace in Rome. This assembly, known to history as the Fourth Lateran Council, was one of the most important and ambitious councils in the entire history of the Church. It issued 71 canons or decrees on everything from the precise definition of the Eucharist, transubstantiation, to the requirement for all adult Christians to confess their sins to their parish priest at least once a year. It was a massive attempt to reform, standardize, and strengthen the Church from top to bottom. And tucked away among these momentous decrees was a short but revolutionary one. Canon 18. This canon explicitly forbade all clergy priests, deacons, bishops, abbots from participating in, or lending any religious sanction to, any form of the trial by ordeal. It declared that no priest was to lend the blessing, consecration, or authority of the Church to any legal procedure that involved the judgment of fire, hot water, cold water, or iron. The theological reasoning behind this momentous decision was subtle but profound. The Church did not suddenly stop believing that God could perform miracles. Rather, the leading theologians of the day, brilliant thinkers at the University of Paris like Peter the Chanter, had come to a new and powerful conclusion. They argued that the Judicium Dei was a form of tempting God. It was, they argued, a sin of profound presumption. In the ordeal, humans were essentially commanding God to show up and perform a miracle on a specific day, at a specific time in a specific place to solve their earthly legal problems. It was turning the omnipotent creator of the universe into a celestial magistrate on call, a divine functionary in the human legal system. This, the new theology concluded, was a gross violation of the proper relationship between humanity and the divine. Humans should pray for God's justice, they should trust in God's ultimate providence, but they should not demand a supernatural sign as part of their routine legal process. The practical effect of Canon 18 was immediate and catastrophic for the ordeal. Without the participation of the priest, the ordeal lost its entire religious and legal legitimacy. It was the priest's presence, the sacredness of the church, the consecration of the elements, the solemn mass, that transformed the act from mere torture into a sacred judgment. Without the priest, forcing a man to carry a hot iron was no longer a judicium Dei. It was just a man burning his hand, a pointless act of cruelty. Being thrown in a river was no longer an aquae frigidi examen. It was just attempted murder. Stripped of its sacred character, the ordeal could not survive as a legitimate legal instrument. And so, secular courts across Europe were suddenly faced with a profound crisis. Their ultimate tool for resolving the most difficult cases, their final court of appeal, had been taken away from them at a stroke. They needed a new method, a new way to reach a verdict when the evidence was unclear. And what emerged from the ashes of the ordeal was the direct ancestor of the system we live under today: the jury. In England, for example, the royal government of King Henry III, in the years immediately following 1215, sent out instructions to its traveling judges. These instructions stated that since the church had now forbidden the ordeal, the judges were faced with a problem. For serious crimes, they were told to imprison the suspects, though this was an unsatisfactory solution. But for other cases, they were instructed to rely on the testimony of the local community. They began to convene groups of 12 lawful men from the neighborhood, the vicinage, who were put under oath to speak the truth, verdictum, about the case. This was the birth of the trial jury. It's important to note that this early jury was not like our modern one. They were not impartial outsiders who knew nothing of the case. They were the opposite. They were chosen precisely because they were locals who were expected to know the people involved, to know their reputations, and to have heard the local gossip. They were, in effect, a panel of community witnesses. But the principle was established. The quest for justice had turned decisively away from the divine and back towards the collective human judgment of the community. When we look back at the trial by ordeal from our modern vantage point, it is easy to dismiss it as a product of a primitive, superstitious, and barbaric age. And by our standards, it certainly was. It was a system that subjected human beings to terror, agony, and often death, based on a belief in supernatural intervention that we no longer share. But to simply dismiss it as irrational nonsense is to miss the profound and very human story at its core. The ordeal was born from a very real, very difficult, and very human problem. How do you find truth in a world without evidence? How do you achieve justice and maintain social peace when you simply cannot know for sure who is guilty? It was a system that, in its own way, tried to be impartial. The hot iron and the cold water were, in theory, blind to a person's wealth or status. More than that, the ordeal offered a kind of terrible comfort. It offered certainty in an uncertain world. In a world of feuds, plagues, and famines, it provided a powerful belief that there was an ultimate, incorruptible judge who could be appealed to, a final arbiter whose verdict was absolute. There was no need for endless doubt or corrosive argument. There was only the clear, final, and indisputable judgment of God. The story of the trial by ordeal is the story of a society's relationship with God, with the nature of truth, and ultimately with itself. It is the story of how a system of justice is always a mirror, reflecting the deepest beliefs, fears, and anxieties of the people it serves. The slow, painful, and revolutionary shift from the ordeal to the jury is therefore not just a minor change in legal history. It is one of the most significant intellectual and psychological shifts in the entire history of Western civilization. It is the story of the moment we, as a society, decided to stop asking God for the answer and to take the awesome, terrifying, and imperfect responsibility for finding justice into our own two hands. What do you think? After immersing ourselves in their world, is there a part of you that can understand the deep, psychological appeal of such a system, the desperate desire for an absolute, divine answer in the face of unbearable uncertainty? Which of the ordeals do you find the most psychologically terrifying? The direct, searing pain and the agonizing weight of the hot iron, or the profoundly counterintuitive, faith-based logic of the cold water? Let me know your thoughts and interpretations in the comments below. Exploring these historical shifts in mindset and how they echo in our own time is what this channel is all about. Your perspective is an essential part of the conversation. If you found this journey into the world of the Judicium Dei and the very foundations of Western law to be a fascinating one, please consider subscribing and enabling notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the dark and complex history of crime, punishment, and the eternal human quest for justice. Thank you for listening.